Thank you for joining this UKLFI webinar at this very difficult time for the state of Israel and the Jewish people around the world. We have been witnessing the worst imaginable horrors, medieval barbarism by Iranian-backed genocidal terrorists from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Israel continues to be under attack. Hamas has again shown its real face as Israel responds to this kind of savagery. We have organised this emergency briefing on the latest developments and strategic and legal analysis to inform you and answer your questions. We've already had many submissions in advance, but please put your further questions into the Q&A facility on Zoom, ladies and gentlemen. I'm joined by Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves, Maurice Hirsch, formerly of the Military Prosecution for Judea and Samaria, where he specialised in the prosecution of terrorists. He has had a number of positions in the Military Advocate General Corps, and following his retirement from the IDF, he worked as head of legal strategies for Palestinian Media Watch. He's currently Senior Legal Analyst at Human Rights Voices and a Director at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. I'm also joined by Yissachar, the head of research at Israel's Defense and Security Forum, or in Hebrew, Habithonistim, or served in the Intelligence Corps' elite 8200 unit, and his research focuses on Iran and Israel's security strategy vis-a-vis the Arab world and the Palestinians. It's very good of both of you to take time, especially at this very chaotic time, to join us. I'm very grateful for your opening remarks, and then we'll move straight to questions. Maurice, if you would kindly start us off. You're on mute still.
Yeah. Hi, so good evening to everyone. As Natasha mentioned, my name is Maurice, background in the Army. I'm going to give you a brief update of what's going on since Saturday morning. I assume that most of you have possibly seen some of the details, but I think it's important to just give a quick recap. On Saturday morning, Shabbat and Simchat Torah in Israel, about 3,000 Palestinian terrorists breached the fence that separates between Gaza and Israel, and entered the Israeli towns and villages and kibbutzim on the fence, going as far as Sderot, really to the big towns. And there they committed tremendous atrocities. They murdered, butchered, I can't use enough superlatives to describe the sites, some 800 people, of them 260 youth who were just participating in a nature party on Friday night and were just in the area. They managed to overrun the IDF sites and patrols, and then really in a very organized fashion carry out probably what is the worst day of Israel's history, including the start of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which the attack, if you are following the dates, was exactly almost 50 years to the day. So we're talking really about an attack that was carried out in a very organized fashion. The 3,000 terrorists that crossed over the fence didn't run haphazardly in all directions, all congregating in one area. They separated themselves off. They ran into the different areas, each one with its specific target. They clearly had very, very good intelligence, probably based, or most likely based, on the thousands of Gazans who have been entering Israel over the last 2-3 years. That has been the policy of Israel's government, to allow not a small amount of workers to come in from Gaza into Israel, to alleviate the financial burden in Gaza and to provide employment and funds, really a humanitarian mission in the full sense of the word. And those workers were probably used by Hamas, if they weren't Hamas members themselves, in order to gather exact, precise intelligence in order to prepare this attack. Now, this attack, we have to understand, isn't something which happens overnight. It is something that we believe has been planned for many, many years. If many of you will probably recall, in 2018, what Hamas then defined as the Great March of Return was to organize groups of Hamas activists, terrorists, and other people on the border, on the fence between Israel and Gaza. And as Yahya Sinwar, the then and current head of Hamas, said very clearly, the goal is to breach the fence and rip the hearts out of the Jews. That's literally what they did. If you haven't seen some of the video footage, then I apologize for what I'm about to describe. One video shows a crazed terrorist taking a hoe, big hoe, and beating over and over and over again at the body of someone lying on the ground, trying to literally decapitate the body. It turns out that that was actually a Thai worker and not a Jew, but they just don't care. The goal was to murder as many people as possible. If you haven't yet seen pictures of the Kedem family, mother, father, 3 children, 3 beautiful little girls, murdered all entirely. If you're talking about the Israeli presence in the kibbutzim on that Gaza fence, take into account now, for example, in places like Be'eri, one of the kibbutzim, in the places like Nachal Oz, there is no one to return there. Everyone was either murdered, or the flip side of the coin, and there are also stories of atrocities being carried out, of people being kidnapped at gunpoint. There's a story of Amit. Amit was working in a dental surgery, providing medical attention, and the terrorists burst in, murdered everyone around her, but Amit's body has not been found, and she is missing. Along with Amit, there are another 130 to 150 other hostages who have been taken, including 84 and 85-year-old senior citizens, children. If you haven't yet seen the pictures from Palestinian Media Watch of Gazan kids belittling and terrorizing a little Israeli kid who's saying, Ima, Ima, mother, mother, then you really haven't seen a sight of horror. These are the experiences that we witnessed. Again, a tremendously traumatic day for Israel that will go down without question in the history as being one of the blackest days in our history. This now requires, obviously, a comprehensive and full-on response. But before we go there, and before maybe Or will continue on with those subjects, I would just like to mention that about 2 weeks ago, I had the tremendous misfortune of penning an article that described what I believe to be the 2023-2024 Gaza conflict, giving 4 reasons why I believed that a conflict with Gaza was imminent. Reason number 1, Qatar. None of them, by the way, have anything to do with Israel. Qatar has, for the last 5 years, been providing the Gazan terrorists with $30 million a month. And Qatar recently decided that they were no longer interested in providing that money. Gaza will be left, the terrorists will be left with a tremendous shortfall of money. How do you then persuade Israel to use its influence on America and on Qatar to continue and even increase the aid? You start a war. Reason number 1. Reason number 2, over the summer, for those of you who have been following, some of the Gazan residents tried to rise up against Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization. They run the Gaza Strip with an iron hand. They were initially elected by popular elections by the Gazan people, but Hamas responded to these elections by violently, really getting rid of any type of dissent, by either targeting the dissidents, targeting the demonstrators, or by just shooting them. That's how Hamas responded. The way to divert the internal pressure on Hamas, which was building up, best way in the world, they've learned it from the Palestinian Authority, when in doubt, start a fight with the Jews. Reason number 3, the world is preparing for the day after Mahmoud Abbas. He's 88 years old. He's in his 19th year of his 4-year term, of his first 4-year term. And the world is discussing which other Fatah crony will inherit his his position. Hamas is annoyed. They won the last elections and they want to be part of the next leadership. They are frustrated by the fact that no one is discussing any type of Hamas future participation in the Palestinian Authority. How do you make yourself relevant again? Attack the Jews. Reason number 3. Reason number 4. The current head of Hamas in Gaza, Yissachar Sinwar, was elected just about 3 years ago. They do actually have elections every 4 years. He's coming up for a re-election in another year. The last time he won the election only on the 3rd round. His win is certainly not guaranteed. And about 2 weeks ago, his probably one of his more staunch rivals that enjoys tremendous support, another violent terrorist called Salah Aruri, announced that he would be campaigning and running for the head of Hamas in Gaza against Yissachar Sinwar. So now these 2 terrorists are having a battle. Who's the baddest terrorist in the area? How do you do that? You attack the Jews. That's reason number 4. These are the 4 what I believe to be the 4 driving factors within Palestinian society as to why the war would have to start. The 5th reason is unconnected necessarily to the Palestinians, but it is really the elephant in the room. Iran sees the discussions of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, Israel, America, Saudi Arabia, sees the changes that have brought on the Abraham Accords, and is interested in every way to hinder and to scuttle that process. This is the hand of Iran. We saw this specifically from the Iranians, the Hamas people meeting with the Iranians previously, planning everything, with them thanking publicly Iran for the weapons, advice and funding that they'd received. And we saw immediately after the massacre, the conversations between Raisi and Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas in general, not just Gaza, not just Yissachar Sinwar. Ismail Haniyeh on the one hand from Hamas, and Zaid Nakhleh, the head of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Immediately, they were all hugging, kissing. We've killed 800, we massacred 800 Jews, women, children, elderly, disabled. Great job, boys. That's what we're fighting against. They obviously have their second proxy up in the north, Hezbollah, waiting to just intervene. And so that, I think, is what's driving and what drove the violence at this specific juncture. I'll maybe stop there for a bit and pass over to Or, and then we can discuss later.
May I just ask one quick follow-up on the basis of what you've said about Hezbollah? There are reports of certainly infiltrations from the north and fire being exchanged. Are you able to give an update on what the situation is on the northern border?
So earlier this afternoon, there have been a number of incidents in the last few days on the northern border with Hezbollah, with rockets and missiles being fired at a very limited scale initially. This afternoon, there were another 12 rockets fired, and Hezbollah took responsibility, obviously. This is a developing situation. Literally just before we started the webinar, there were new instructions from Israel's home front as to what to do for the residents on that northern border. And so it does appear that there is some type of confrontation building up there. There are conflicting reports. On the one hand, the Lebanese Minister of Defense said that Hezbollah is committed to not entering the conflict while if Israel does not attack sovereign Lebanese territory. On the other hand, you can't believe Hezbollah because they are terrorists. They have no value for their word, and their goal, run by their Iranian masters, is to attack and to destroy Israel. So I wouldn't give any weight whatsoever to the promises that they make, and Israel needs to rely on itself and on itself alone in order to make sure that Hezbollah is deterred and understands that. Again, let's just go back historically. 2006, the Hamas had just won the elections. They've just taken over the Gaza Strip. They breached the fence. They kidnapped Gilad Shalit on the 25th of June 2006. 2 weeks later, on the 12th of July 2006, Hezbollah breaches the northern fence, attacks the jeeps, kidnaps the bodies of Udi Regev and Ehud Goldwasser, and the Second Lebanese War starts. So what we're seeing at the moment is definitely not something new. It's something which Israel knows to potentially anticipate a continuation war on our northern front.
Thank you. Or we understand that you're starting active duty tomorrow. Thank you for joining us at short notice.
Good to be here.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Natasha. First of all, let me just say how very touching and moving we were by all the messages and support that we received for the past 48 hours. Myself, I received numerous, maybe dozens of messages from people from across the world, asking for us, and that was really a beam of light in this darkest hour. I'm currently in Jerusalem. Last few hours I ran several times to the bomb shelter. So if any of that happens again, please, you would have to forgive me, and I would have to find shelter if necessary. With your permission, I'd like to focus on two main topics that I believe shaped the chain of events of the past 48 hours since Saturday morning. One is really the Hamas behavior that was often rationalized, I believe, by various actors, tried to be either explained or rationalized. And we saw the extent of brutality, the extent of ISIS-type sadism that has taken place in southern Israel. And number two, maybe the shattered pieces of the Israeli conception that has not been proven tenable in light of Saturday morning's events and the war that is unfolding and is imminent and is ongoing right now. And let me just begin by, a military historian, Victor Davis Hanson, who said that war is about people. It's a story of people. And over the past 48 hours, I was exposed to so many horror stories of loved ones and people who have heard really stories of their loved ones being kidnapped or taken, or they lost contact with them. I myself I woke up at 6:30 a.m. local time on Saturday morning by the sound of sirens in central Israel, and we either thought it was either a mistake, which sometimes happens, or would be probably a siren test. But very clearly, it became clear that soon it became clear that we're in for not just a round of fighting. At first, I thought that either Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad was attempting to just launch another rocket attack against Israel in order to leverage his achievements in the next round of negotiations with Israel. But then we heard stories about ground invasion and possibly paratroopers infiltrating through the border, because everybody believed that the fence is impenetrable. But go back to Major General Gershon Cohen in his book, and we at the IDSF, Israel's Defense and Security Forum, we've been analyzing this topic since we were established in 2020. For at least 3 years, we've been warning about the failures and conceptions of the Israeli security establishment. And this moment is of no joy, needless to say, but it is also a moment of reckoning that the current status quo cannot continue. The current conception of the impenetrable and indefensible and really victorious, I would say, or having the upper hand in terms of our defense establishment has not proven solid in light of this surprise attack. Gershon Cohen said in his book about the security fence in Judea and Samaria, he said that the core assumption that constructing a fence is an element of security or is a foundation of security is fundamentally erroneous. It is you cannot rely on a fence in order to survive. You cannot hide in the trenches behind the fence and fight in defense if you don't take the initiative, as we have been doing in Judea and Samaria over the past 20 years, arresting daily Palestinians in their cities. none of this Hamas infrastructure would ever have been possible around Judea and Samaria. What has been possible in Gaza and has blown up in its fullest extent on Saturday, because once Hamas has taken over the territory, as Maurice said, it has started its force buildup, and Israel could do nothing, absolutely nothing about it, because we are on the other side of the fence. With the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, we have daily friction. We arrest terrorists who plot this kind of attacks, and I believe that really the stories that you hear about the Hamas behavior, as Maurice described, there are no more people practically in the kibbutz of Be'eri. We have heard about a mother who terrorists infiltrated into their homes and kidnapped her with her 2 kids, walked her into Gaza, and for some reason they left her midway, and she had to conceal herself behind a mound before running back into Israel. Heard stories about entire military bases whose soldiers have either been kidnapped or bodies being desecrated, or the Watchtower analysts been kidnapped as well. And of course, the massive massacre at the Nature Party, where people ran away right into an ambush of automatic riflery and M16s, who have literally butchered hundreds of people in the same day. As Maurice said, since the Holocaust, there had not been as many Jews murdered in the same day as Saturday, October 7th in Israel. And I received phone calls from people who were eager for their loved ones in Sderot. It's a major city in southern Israel, who have been out of electricity for several hours, several days, because terrorist vans ran through electricity pillars, and it did not enable this electricity network and net to function. And I believe this really, the aggregate picture shows both a tactical failure, but also, I think, a conceptual failure, because we have, for some reason, believed that Hamas is deterred, number one, and number two, that it doesn't have the capabilities to carry out such an attack. I think if I could leave the rest of my analysis to the Q&A section, but I would finish at this. I believe that the Israel has been nurturing quite diligently, but it has been nurturing this conception that one, Hamas is deterred, and two, that you can live in a tenable fashion with this aggregate of problems around you, be it Hamas force buildup in Gaza, be it the Hezbollah force buildup in the north. I remind you, Hezbollah has aggregated over 150,000 rockets in Lebanon, including attack drones, UAVs, and precision guided missiles. But it has also failed to address the head of the snake, as we call it, because we constantly talk about the proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, and the Palestinian faction. The Iranian leader himself, Khamenei, touted his achievements on Twitter, saying that the Zionist regime is dying. His words, the Zionist regime is dying, sharing videos of Israelis running for their lives in southern Israel and touting his major achievement. Me, as an intelligence analyst, I can tell you that this attack could never have been carried out without Iranian guidance, Iranian training. It is simply impossible for Hamas, given the current conditions, to carry out individually, and not to mention without Iran's approval and consent. And I believe that Saturday morning changed so much in Israel, in the sense that nothing can ever be the same. Israel cannot keep sort of kicking the can down the road and procrastinating the moment where it has to confront problems head on, and keeps sort of, instead of tackling root causes and root problems, we keep gardening, right? We keep sort of trimming, and rather than actually targeting the root causes of the mounting strategic challenges around us. The amount of NGOs in Israel covered up like shell companies for terrorist organizations and covering up as human rights organizations funded by some European governments. We see incitement by members of Knesset from Arab parties overtly expressing overt approval of Hamas. Students and university professors expressing their support of Hamas and Hezbollah, and they're not being handled. We see massive tens of thousands of illegal structures all around Judea and Samaria and the Negev by both Palestinians and Bedouins and in Arab cities in Israel. And none of that has been taken care of because the Israeli policy has traditionally been to avert war and avert conflict. And this whole notion would have to be reconsidered, recalculated, and reobserved. And I would be happy to elaborate during the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It strikes me that there's also an argument that Israeli policy or approach has inevitably also been shaped by a great deal of international pressure to do exactly what you have discussed. And I wonder what conversations there will be in the international community about how misguided that pressure must now be plainly apparent to them. There are many, many questions that have come in. Perhaps if we start with some of the main legal points and the question of proportionality. Maurice, if I could put that to you. Now that we are starting to see the Israeli response, it's already being accused of disproportionate action in many media fora. Plainly, a comparison of the body count has no place in the application of proportionality principles in international law. Could you give your analysis and your insights to assist those hundreds of people who have joined this briefing with responding to the charge of disproportionate action by the State of Israel?
Yes, I'm happy, Natasha. It must be stressed that proportionality in international humanitarian law, in the laws of war, is not, as Vancini says, as the giant sister Vancini in The Princess Bride. You use that word too much. I don't think you know what it means. And so let's define exactly what proportionality in international law is. Proportionality, or the equation for proportionality, says that the incidental damage caused by any single attack. It's not a general view of proportionality. Well, they fired X missiles, so we fired Y missiles. It's every attack on an individual basis, that the incidental damage caused by any single attack should not be excessive in comparison to the concrete military advantage that is sought to be had. That is the equation of proportionality on international in international law, and nothing else in the laws of war. So in order to discuss whether Israel's response is proportionate to anything, well, you just can't do that, because that's not the reference in international humanitarian law. You're discussing a specific event, firstly. Secondly, there are many requirements of international law that really can be cut up into four different categories. One of them is proportionality, but let's just talk about proportionality for a little bit longer, seeing as the equation is quite difficult. And to the best of my knowledge, possibly Natasha will correct me if I'm wrong, no one has ever stood trial in an international criminal court for an act of disproportionate use of force. So when we're talking about what is that proportionality, it's very hard to say. So the example that I've given previously is, if you have a big house, right? A big house, you have a family living there. There's Mahmoud and Fatma, his wife, and his 8 children, and they're living there in their little house. But under the house, there is a stockpile of Hamas missiles. It is a clear military target. Fatma and Ahmed are there to, as human shields, to defend those weapons. Now, would it be proportional to attack that target, which is a clear military target? Attacking ammunition stockpiles is obviously a clear military target. Would it be proportional then to possibly incidentally kill Fatma and Ahmed and the children, assuming that they're not themselves terrorists? So the answer, I would assume, to that would be quite obviously yes. On the other hand, if you have a situation where you have Ahmed and Fatma and their 8 little children living in the same little house, but one of the children found on the street a bullet and brought it home, well, the Israeli intelligence caught the bullet there, and now that is a military target. If you then attack that target with the purpose of destroying that one bullet, but on the way also kill 10, 15 people, then that would possibly be seen as disproportionate. I say possibly because, again, this equation is something which is very much in the eye of the beholder. What did a reasonable military commander seek to achieve as his military goal? And what was the incidental damage caused? Does he have to be aware of every single person in the house? Absolutely not. It's based on his honest belief of what he understands to be the situation. So if he is now attacking a clearly military target and there are more civilians than he possibly thought would be there, that is irrelevant according to international law. Now, this sounds very heartless. It sounds heartless because potentially children will even be killed in the course of military actions. But that's not a problem with Israel. That's not a problem with the way we would conduct our warfare. That is a question of international law. This has been international law for probably 150 years. And so that's how wars are fought. If you don't want to endanger citizens, don't get up on a Shabbat morning and go out and massacre 800 Jews. And therefore any comparison based on the word proportionality and then claiming that it is a provision of international law is something which should be rejected outright. There are literally dozens of websites that you can go into, just do a search for the 4 laws of war, and you will find those 4 principles there: the distinction, military necessity, proportionality, and humanity or unnecessarily suffering. Those are the 4 principles. We can go into each one if we have time. But that's something which really should be understood when anyone claims that Israel's response is disproportionate. They're just using a word that they really don't understand what it means.
Time is not on our side. We have an overwhelming number of questions, which I think is testament to how little of this information has actually made its way to broadcast media internationally. But very grateful for that, Maurice. And of course, it bears stating that there's a standard of international law, as you have set out, and then there is also the standard that Israel applies, which many military experts have consistently pointed out is usually way above the standards required by international law. And so that is certainly something that we expect will continue throughout this response. Or could I put a number of questions to you together?
Please.
And I'm going to seek the briefest responses from both of you going forward as possible, so we can cover as many. The first was a question about the border setup. Egypt's built a wall on their side of the border with Gaza. Why did Israel not do the same? You've mentioned analysis on the border defenses. Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, so the Egyptian side, make no mistake about it, has not been bulletproof. Palestinians have been digging tunnels underneath Rafah. It's a city that has actually been divided between the Gazan side and the Egyptian side. The Egyptians have been traditionally refusing to give Gaza the small enclave called the other side of Rafah and to make it part of Gaza and demanded that the border actually goes in direct line, crossing the town of Rafah in the middle. That has triggered ever since for 2 decades, to be honest, has been a major focal point where a hotspot for smuggling. Everywhere, just bear this rule in mind. Everywhere we have medicine smuggling, human smuggling, drug smuggling, you also have terrorism smuggling. You have weapons, Iranian, even rockets and parts of rockets that have been smuggled through these tunnels underneath Rafah. But the Israeli Gazan fence is not impenetrable, and we have to understand this. No fence that is passive, and that every obstacle is designed for the next means to bypass it. And we believe that this is exactly why you need to win in offense and not defense. Fences only help in order to mitigate with the ongoing infiltrator 1 or 2. It doesn't help you to shape strategy, because you can always come with a tractor and ram through it, just like the Palestinians did on Saturday. So I believe we failed in our fence policy, even though we handled masterfully, really, we handled perfectly all the previous rounds of riots on the fences. I remind you that some Western governments that denounced the disproportionate use of power, use of force by Israeli troops who were absolutely following the law and targeting people who were actually firing live ammunition on soldiers in their military posts, throwing IEDs on the fence, and they attempted to shoot nearby their feet in order to drive them away from the fence. And I've personally been in conferences where they just simply accused Israel of butchering innocent young Palestinians without pondering about the cause of such, why would Israeli soldiers simply wake up and say it's a good morning to kill Palestinians? It's a good day to kill Palestinians. This is not Israeli policy, and these are not the instructions that me as a soldier would have received in this kind of situation.
Sticking with the border between Egypt and Gaza for a moment, there's a question about the legal or political reason given for the closure by Egypt and whether that border could be opened to provide a safe exit for Gazan refugees to minimize fatalities. We've seen Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister's instructions for civilians to leave the area. What pressure can be brought upon Egypt to facilitate that?
Please, Maurice, I can see you nodding fiercely, so I'll let you make a start. Yeah.
It's erroneous to argue that the border with Egypt is closed. The numbers provided by OCHA, the UN organization for humanitarian assistance, show that since the beginning of the year there have been some 100,000 exits from Gaza into Egypt. There is also a passage of goods and services. That border is open, can be opened. It will most likely be closed by Hamas and the other terrorists as a means to commit just another war crime and to prevent the civilian population from running away from the danger, so to ensure that they can use them and abuse them to the maximum effect as human shields. But for anyone looking for information on that, if you just go onto the site of OCHA OPT, they have a data section, and it has numbers for the Gaza crossings, both into Egypt and into Israel. Into Israel, by the way, there's been some 400,000 entries since the beginning of the year alone. And so that's the picture. The Gaza border with Egypt is open, can be left open, should be left open. Egypt should be taking in, obviously, any refugees that come running. And Hamas should not be allowed to use and abuse the civilian population as human shields.
I'd just like to mention very, very briefly, I know many people wonder whether Gaza is a very highly densely populated area and notorious for being a densely populated area would be able to facilitate Israeli strike this way. Gaza is definitely a dense place. There's no doubt about it. But there has been a myth going on circulating in too many circuits that Gaza is the densest place in the world. Please, we would like to debunk some myths tonight as well. Gaza is not even close to be the densest place in the world. It's, by some calculation, but by some measures, it's number 63 in the world. In terms of density, it has about around 2 million inhabitants over a little over 360 square kilometers. That would be around 6,800 people per square kilometers. Definitely, by all measures, that would be dense. But my home city of Holon has 10,000 people for every square kilometers. Same goes for New York City. Dhaka in Bangladesh would be 34,000 people per square kilometers. Tokyo is much more dense than Gaza. So please, when people bring up this argument to you, know what to respond. Gaza is definitely not a prison. It's definitely not under siege. It's definitely not the densest place in the world. So there have been many. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been traditionally romanticized. I agree to. But it does not mean that every single stereotype or, superlative can be thrown in midair and once it's repeated and reiterated thousands of times, it becomes the truth. I wanted to bring that up. Yeah.
Or if I could continue with you and pose a few questions that have arisen from your remarks, perhaps you can deal with them together. The first is, what is a possible long-term solution, and how might this operation be different to the previous occasions of mowing the grass, as they have been termed. Are you suggesting military action against Iran as well as against Hamas and Hezbollah? And are we going to see a massive ground invasion? What is the best way to deal with the hostages? There's quite a lot there, but I think they're really, perhaps you can deal with those together.
Yeah, with pleasure. No pressure, right? I mean, we only have a few minutes, but I will do the best that I can. First, let me refer to the ground invasion question and the future of Gaza. I think that in the current state of affairs, the Israeli political echelon has no choice but to make a ground invasion. The Israeli public will never forgive such a massive loss of momentum. We always in Israel are rightfully considerate of the public opinion among the international community and the criticism on behalf of our closest allies. And once you have the U.S. administration telling Israel, for example, in 2014, in the Israel-Hamas conflict in 2014, that all parties should come back to their senses, all parties, as in Israel as a democratic state and Hamas a terrorist group would be one and the same, then you have a problem because you are a sovereign state, but you are not actually a sovereign state. You don't exist in a vacuum. You need to consider a broad area of calculation. So I would say that Israel has full international credit now to act. I don't think that ground invasion is necessarily a bad move. On the contrary, I think it's a chance once and for all to clear what we call the hornet's nest, the terrorist hub that has been growing in Gaza for the past 20 years. And let me also say that it does not mean that more civilians would be hurt. On the contrary, IDF soldiers have been operating around Judea and Samaria for 20 years. Very little civilian casualties, despite publications, despite all sorts of smears on the part of NGOs claiming, a disproportionate number of civilians hurt. Actually, if troops on the ground are operating, there is far less chance for civilians to be hurt, but also a much higher chance that our troops would be hurt. That's a very serious consideration for Israeli political echelon as well. The future of Gaza, let me tell you, it's not an easy. It's by no means would be an easy task to be feigning to paint an optimistic picture of Gaza, nor could we ever describe an optimistic future for Iraq. The Palestinians would have to take responsibility over themselves, and they would have to take some principles that have been, a tradition for the past 70 years, accuse Israel of their situation, accuse the international community for not assisting them enough. One Saudi diplomat remarked that with all the money we gave the Palestinian Authority, that they could have floored the entire Palestine with gold. They have received more funds than West Germany after World War II by a large margin. And I think they have to take responsibility of themselves. And what I see in the Gaza Strip, although I cannot feign to prophesize, would be, control zones, few separate zones where local Palestinian officials run everyday lives, the civilian aspect of it, and Israel would have to maintain military control as it does in Judea and Samaria. That would be arrests, that would be targeted killings. About Iran's role, I cannot, sit here and pretend that I know what Israel is up to, but I do know that we have full international credit to act. And right now, the situation with Iran is so dire. Iran has amassed over 120 kilos of 60% enriched uranium. In English, that would be 2 weeks away from a nuclear bomb. Okay, it's only a matter of decision rather than capability to the moment that the Iranian regime manufactures a nuclear bomb. You see what the Iranian regime is capable of without nuclear weapons. 800 Israelis killed by this large-scale invasion. I do not want to imagine what the Iranian regime will be capable of and how many Jews it will be able to murder with nuclear weapons. So the international community has been somewhat forgiving, I would say, striking this 2015 deal. I can elaborate on later if you wish. That has been actually looking the other way while Iran is enriching full stop, absolutely no breaks. And I do believe that some sort of action would have to be taken against Iran because this has come from the highest levels of the Iranian regime, this attack. It is becoming clearer and clearer and time goes by. We saw the Wall Street Journal publication, but I didn't have to see it in order to know for quite to be sure. We have this thing called Israel Security Briefing. It's a bi-weekly product and output that we at the IDSF Research Department are publishing for every 2 weeks. So if you go to our website, idsf.org, uk.il, you'll see it right there. And it's funny because in the latest one, we talked about Netanyahu's trip to the UN and the whole prospect of Israeli-Saudi normalization. And what Netanyahu said was that the Iran will try to sabotage Israeli-Saudi normalization. Iran will try to hamper. And what we saw by a Hezbollah statement right after the attack, that now all Arab countries should reconsider their normalization efforts with Israel and pick sides. A Hezbollah statement. And Hezbollah cannot put the statement alone without Iranian guidance. It's Iranian Inc. writing a Hezbollah statement. And I would pay very close attention to what Iran is up to over the next few hours, over the next few days. That will determine the outcome of this war.
Maurice, may I ask, pose the next question to you, which is there a possibility after Hamas are hopefully defeated that Egypt could, with UN approval, enter and administer Gaza? Do you have any thoughts on
I think that the approval would need to come more from Israel rather than from the UN. I think it sounds like a nice idea to connect Gaza to Egypt, but when we take into account that Egypt controlled Gaza for the 20 years between 1948 and 1967, but as opposed to Jordan that tried to annex the Judea and Samaria, Egypt never laid formal claim to Gaza, saying that it was part of its territory. I don't think the Egyptians necessarily want a vast Muslim Brotherhood supporting population joining its already potentially radicalized population. And so, whilst it's possibly a nice idea, I think that it's something of a non-starter, simply because the Egyptians just aren't interested in that trouble.
And just remaining with you for a moment, if I may, a further question posed to you. Your first speaker referred to 4 main reasons for Hamas committing these acts. Given this attack must have been in the planning over many, many months, how many of those reasons were operative in the decision-making so long ago?
So almost all of them were relevant. The Qatari decision has been, whilst it was finally made now, already for the last few months, there have been hiccups in the transfer of the aid. Already starting in March, there were a few delays, as they said, technical delays. The announcement, obviously, of Salah Harouri that he would run against Yahya Sinwar is something which was formally announced now, but it's been something which was very clear that these two leaders are setting themselves up against each other and vying to be the best terrorist in the world. And really, the discussions about Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, and him leaving the scene have been going on for I think for almost a year and a half. When the Americans first started entertaining the terrorist Hussein al-Sheikh, who is a PLO member and is therefore automatically barred from America unless given specific permission, but he got that permission. So these are factors that have been playing in all the time. The summer demonstrations by the Gazans were really also the end of that whole cycle. They've been building up slowly but surely over also for the last year and a half, even 2 years. So I think all of those factors were relevant for these decisions, and they've all been there for quite a long time.
The question of hostages, perhaps I can pose that to both of you. We've touched on the existence of this hostage situation. One questioner asks, when will Israel, the US and UK learn that we pay our enemies too high a price for hostages and so encourage further hostage taking? And also references Gilad Shalit and the 1,027 prisoners that were exchanged to secure his release. Is there anything either of you can or wishes to say on perhaps the most harrowing aspect of the last few days and what possible resolution there may be to that issue?
So I think that we're all going to regret the $6 billion that US President Biden paid Iran in order to secure the release of the 4 Americans. I would assume that that was money that was potentially even automatically, immediately used for furthering the goal of Hamas and Hezbollah activity. Really, President Biden undermining his own goal of creating normalization for his own purposes, his own electoral purposes, between Israel and Saudi Arabia. That was a disastrous decision. Similarly, the Shalit deal, as someone who personally participated in prosecuting many of the terrorists who were released in that deal, and then in 2014 as the head of the prosecution, as the person who initiated the rearrest of many of those terrorists after the kidnapping of the 3 boys in Gush Etzion. I can clearly say that those terrorists do not stop being terrorists because they've been released as part of a deal. They continue on being terrorists. They continue on with their goals. Let's not forget anyone that Yahya Sinwar, the terrorist who heads Hamas in Gaza now, and who is directly responsible for the atrocities on Shabbat, was released in the Shalit deal. Clearly, we have paid far too high a price. But on the other hand, what price would you think is reasonable to receive back another 130 of our citizens alive and well? What do you do with that equation? When you break down Shalit into its 2 sections, there were 2 sections of Shalit. The first 477 were the big major murderers, and the remaining 550 were terrorists who were due to be released in the next in the following 6 months to a year anyway. Was that too high a price to receive an Israeli soldier back alive? When you compare it to previous deals that we've done in the past, it's a disastrous policy. It's something which Israel should have changed that equation years ago. And anyone who says that it feeds more kidnapping and more terrorism is 100% right.
I may refer to that very briefly.
Yeah, of course.
Very briefly, please. Yes. First of all, it's not a good day to be an Israeli prime minister in any day, but today especially in light of the question of the hostages, I would not want to be someone who is making decisions right now, because no matter what choice you make, the alternative is either as bad or worse. The situation is that, as Maurice said, we have over 130 people kidnapped in Gaza, women, children, babies, elderly, who are simply held hostage by Hamas. It's a war crime by any parameter, and it should be condemned as such. And I believe that Israel has, as what I said in my opening remarks, that nothing can ever be the same again in Israel's policy toward terrorism. I mean it. We have recently passed a law that says the Israel and the IDSF and Maurice and other elements who were especially supportive of this law to revoke citizenship from terrorists and to expel them, to deport them to Palestinian Authority territories. We've actually compared this proposal with the British model, where, if I'm not mistaken, 58 people have had their citizenship revoked, stripped off in the UK, and not all of them sent back to their home countries. Some of them had dual citizenships. I believe 2 of them did not have dual citizenships. And not just the Shemaima Begum case, but other cases as well, a certain Sudanese citizen as well. So Israel has been reluctant to deal with terrorism in the language that terrorism understands. And I think it will all have to change now. I'll just give you an example. Maurice mentioned the terrorist swap, the swap deals that have been taking place. One of our followers here mentioned that 1,027 prisoners that Israel exchanged in return for Gilad Shalit. Israel has been releasing hundreds of prisoners alive, including into Gaza, over the past decade, free of charge. People have to understand this. Every couple of months, certain number of prisoners is being released. This is precisely the point that Leah Goldin, the mother of Hadar Goldin, the kidnapped soldier, has made that since Hadar's kidnapping, hundreds of Palestinians have been released free of charge instead of using them as leverage in order to pressure Hamas to release her son immediately. And without demanding price, Israel has been releasing these prisoners because they finished their term of prison time. So this will all has to change. If you try to murder a Jew, you cannot simply step into prison for 5, 6, 7 years, or even 20 years, or even 40 years and walk out. You are a bargaining chip in order, especially if you're a Hamas terrorist, in order to use you as leverage when these things happen. I think Israel has to change its entire approach to terrorism, including when it comes to prisoners and hostages.
And just on the subject, I'll note the statement released by the International Committee of the Red Cross requiring the proper treatment of the hostages that Hamas has taken. I don't think anyone is under any illusions that will be in any way adhered to. And of course, some of the indications are already of an extremely
Hamas, by the way, Natasha, is already covering itself and has already announced today that some of the hostages have been killed in the Israeli bombings of the northern areas of Gaza. And they said that in the same way as Israel is killing the Palestinians, so they are also killing the Israeli hostages. They're already using the hostages as human shields and killing them and blaming us before anything has already happened. So that's the level of that depravity.
And that's quite apart, of course, from the abuse and other depravity that we have come to learn. Hamas and ISIS, of course, are extremely similar in their tactics and their approaches. On the international involvement, one questioner asks about the number of truces that have been brokered by signatories who it states were given assurances to stop supplies of munitions to the Gaza Strip. What insurance does Israel get when such agreements are flagrantly breached? And can it expect guarantees in future agreements? I know there's already been a strong indication, I think from you both, that Israel can only rely on itself, but inevitably there is strong international involvement. Maurice, are you able to speak to any of the legal implications of agreements that have been brokered and whether or not there is any recourse?
Well, I think the main problem is that the weapons that we are seeing are weapons that are mostly being smuggled into the Gaza Strip via the tunnels from Egypt. Egypt either tacitly or openly agrees for the flow of weapons. We're not seeing many weapons coming in through Ashdod and through Israel and then filtering on through to the terrorists. What we are seeing, however, is a very quite well developed, I have to say, Hamas industry of missile making. Instead of building hospitals and electricity power points, they've been developing weapons and other munitions. So really the commitments of Western countries not to arm Hamas, I think that we've possibly been able to rely upon. But when you have the Iranians and to an extent anyone else on that axis of terror, really trying to smuggle in the weapons in any direction, that's something we have to be worried about. Just as a note there, the reason, if everyone remembers, on May 31, 2010, Israel intercepted the Mavi Marmara, trying to break the maritime blockade on Gaza. That maritime blockade was implemented because of the fear of the free flow of weapons specifically from Lebanon down the Mediterranean coast and then into Gaza. We had a number of incidents when that was tried. It's not only the famous Karin A in 2001, but also the Santorini, and we can go on with those examples after that. Iranian weapons already then being shipped down the coast to support the terrorists, and that's what the maritime blockade is all about. You can read about that in the report of the Palmer Commission, the UN Commission that declared the blockade to be legal. It is legal. It was declared legal by a UN body. And so also when we're talking about the siege and the blockade on Gaza, people should know that there is specific reasons to prevent the free flow of armaments to these homicidal terrorists, and legal backing in order to give that the coverage to make sure that it is implemented in a legal way.
Our webinars in the normal course last an hour, but these are extraordinary times. We still have hundreds of people with us. If you are both content to continue a little longer, there are still many, many questions that I will try and get through. Or may I ask you, the questionnaire states, how will the Arab street throughout the Middle East perceive what has happened, and when, or forgive me, what then are the implications for future progress of a deal with Saudi? Could I also perhaps supplement that with the inevitable observation that the grotesque videos that Hamas has been circulating, perhaps not all of them as publicly, certainly they haven't been on broadcast media. Many of them have probably also not been on social media, but they are being circulated throughout the Middle East and Europe, and having a strong inciting effect, no doubt. So if you could perhaps comment on what we might expect, both in terms of the geopolitical sphere, but also if you feel able to, the situation for Jewish communities around the world in light of that incitement that is entirely new. I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, thank you for that question. President Bush, after 9/11, has said that all countries must choose now, either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. And I think this is really a 9/11 moment for the Arab street and for youngsters around the world and for Jewish communities around the world. I remember after the three teenagers were abducted and murdered in 2014, which triggered a chain of events that ultimately resulted in another round of fighting between Israel and Gaza. Mahmoud Abbas, the president, he's referred to as a Palestinian president. He's the chairman of the Palestinian Authority. He actually called Prime Minister Netanyahu for the first time breaking a multi-year silence. He actually unequivocally condemned this act. He had a lot of pressure on him to do that. He is no big friend of Israel by no means, but he did succumb to pressure. We don't see any such statement by Mahmoud Abbas right now. And on the contrary, he's accusing Israel of committing war crimes against Gaza, etc. I just received an update that over 900 Israelis were murdered. The number has been updated. So we can see the level of atrocities, and the Palestinian, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority is still, sticking to the old dogmas. And this has to trigger a response by all European countries who are funneling money to the Palestinian Authority, who are forgiving about the incitement, the Palestinian Authority's education system, about the way in which Palestinian textbooks, make anti-Semitic, use anti-Semitic stigmas and stereotypes, and teach children the laws of physics by, shooting with rogatka on a soldier, or mimicking Jews in order to teach the laws of grammar. It simply cannot continue. UNRWA cannot continue the way it has been operating until now. And this is really a make or break moment also for young Arabs around the Middle East. Now, I'm not expecting much from people who are hostile to Israel. I know that chains like Al Jazeera and others who have been excelling in twisting reality, just, minor incident a few weeks ago, an Israeli police officer, actually a Druze person who has been, guarding around the old city of Jerusalem, and was attacked by a Muslim woman. Palestinian woman was attacked with a knife. The kitchen knife was extremely clear, and you can see in the CCTV footage how he's being attacked. And he's much more, physically massive than her. He simply pushed her away and shoved her away from him. And the Arab media showed only the part where an Israeli officer pushes a Palestinian woman. Now, this whole thing cannot continue. The Israeli police officers, quote unquote, attacking worshippers on Temple Mount during Ramadan, where they actually tried to secure the place for Muslim worshippers because there were really thugs paid for by Hamas, by Turkey, by Jordan, by various elements, by Iran indirectly, in order to entrench themselves inside the mosque, shoot live ammunition, throw rocks equipped with bats and other means, attacking worshippers, attacking soldiers. But the Israeli police trying to restore order and peace and quiet to Temple Mount in this holiest of times, and they are slandered in such a manner, even by Western governments. This cannot continue. So people need to make a choice in this regard. The Arab Street, I believe many of them were also shocked by these images. Some of them, I believe, I'm sure were not. But the normalization effort between many of them and Israel, I believe this is a major point where they have to decide really in whose side they're on. And a word about the Jewish communities around the world. I am really, my heart goes out, and it is really moving to see all the warm words that you've been sending us in Israel. We've been hearing this, and please do not think that your words are unheard. We've been hearing these such warm and words and concerns that you've been voicing for the past 2 days, and it's been exceptionally touching. I do want you to keep safe. I know that in these dangers of times, they tend to uptick security on Jewish synagogues and Jewish schools. I know myself and people I'm in touch with that they boosted the security on schools and synagogues, already pretty fortified fortresses as they are, Chabad houses, synagogues. Please be on the lookout, be vigilant, and keep safe. Okay, we here we'll wish you, if you need any sort of advice, security, or any sort of assistance, you know whom to turn to.
Maurice, just before I bring you in on Saudi, if I may, that there is a question that goes specifically to the UK, the direct correlation between terrorist attacks and anti-Semitism increase, and the question of what UK lawyers can be doing to tackle the uptick in support for Hamas from trade unions, fringes of political parties, public bodies, local authorities, universities, and on college campuses. This is something we are actively engaged in. There has already been some sickening scenes in London at fringe events at the Labour Party conference, and support for Hamas being voiced. Actually, perhaps as we are speaking, there is a Palestine Solidarity Campaign rally outside the embassy in London. I should say that, of course, Hamas is now a proscribed terrorist organization under the Terrorism Act 2000, expressing for support for Hamas with the intention or expectation of encouraging support for Hamas is a criminal offence, contrary to Section 12(1)(a). We will be, of course, pressing for prosecution of offenders in appropriate cases. It's worth noting, though, that those sorts of prosecutions do require approval both from the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney General. And we are therefore entirely in the hands of the UK authorities as to whether or not these criminal offences are properly dealt with. Maurice, could I perhaps on that ask for your input as to whether you have any views on the impact of a potential future Saudi agreement with Israel, which I know we were all very much hoping for this time last week?
Well, so I think we have to understand and really put into perspective the idea of the Israeli-Saudi normalization. It isn't happening as a result of Israel's pretty blue eyes, even though we have an amazing country. It's happening because it really is just as much a Saudi interest as it is an Israeli interest. Nothing has changed over the last 3 days in that picture. The Iranians and everyone are trying to really do the best they're possible and their utmost to throw a spanner in the works. But it should be clearly understood that is really a game changer. It would change the entire area to have normalization between Israel and another Islamic country, another Middle Eastern country. As I'm sure many of you saw, or those who didn't see. Just watch the speech of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu in the UN just a few weeks ago, where he showed a map showing what a difference it will make to really turning the Middle East into this massive green zone of friendship and relations some colder, some warmer. Let's not be under any illusions that the peace with Egypt is such a divine thing, or that the peace with the Jordanians is something which is so tremendous. I mean, as we saw just yesterday, an Egyptian policeman murdering 2 Jews walking down the streets in Cairo. We're seeing these developments. It's things that happen all the time in Jordan. So we can't say that we've got the best neighbors in the neighborhood, but at least we don't have open hostilities. And that is something which is of great importance. With Saudi Arabia, truthfully, we don't have any beef. Like, we've got no fight with Saudi Arabia. They're not interested in our territory. We're not interested in their territory. We have a lot to gain from mutual relations. We share the Red Sea together. And there is a lot of business that could be done using the Eilat Ashkelon, even oil pipe, which saves a lot of traveling time. So there is a lot of mutual interests that are there between us and Saudi Arabia. Most of Saudi Arabia just geographically is a desert wasteland. They could gain tremendously from Israel's experience and expertise in literally making the desert bloom, in irrigation projects to regain territory from the desert. So one would hope that even after this war is over, then the Israeli-Saudi relations will continue. Let's also just take into account that for the last 3 years, pretty much, Saudi Arabia has given $0 to the Palestinian Authority. They are not Qatar. They are not the European Union. They recognize who these terrorists are, and they decided a long time ago, once Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, aligned themselves with the axis of terror in Tehran, they were no longer somebody that they wanted to fund. So really, the Saudis have no lost love on the Palestinians. Where they're obviously brothers, they would say, but I would offer the example that they're far estranged brothers like Esav and Yaakov, rather than being loving brothers in the family. So I think Saudi Arabia and us would carry on the same path of really making that normalization, like Or said previously, and people really have to take into account, even in the Arab street, there has been, and specifically in Saudi Arabia, substantial bloggers remarking and commenting and condemning the barbarism of the terrorists. You don't murder babies. You don't murder elderly women. That's something that Islam doesn't really accept. Definitely not Saudi Arabia and not the people there. So this is something which I don't think is going to be a tremendous obstacle. Even the Arab world understands that a red line, and a very, very thick, deep red line of blood was crossed here, and Israel has every legitimate reason to respond with utmost force.
Going to try and draw in a few questions in the brief time we have left together. There are quite a number on the question of electricity. Maurice, could I perhaps put these to you? Allegations of collective punishment. Israel has cut off electricity and some other utilities. Of course, there is still Hamas's capacity to generate electricity in the Gaza Strip. Could you address some of the allegations that I know you'll be familiar with that have already surfaced with respect to electricity, and perhaps provide people with points to respond on?
So let's make a brief history of the electricity situation in Gaza. Israel liberates the Gaza Strip in 1967, finds a dilapidated area with very little infrastructure. Egypt had completely neglected the area. Israel invested a tremendous amount of money and resources into providing a more reasonable and more widespread electricity grid in the Gaza Strip, and has kept that up all the time. Israel obviously had that interest to do so, because we had Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip until 2005 and Israeli military bases. In 2005, we pulled everyone out. There is no more interest in Israel to provide electricity for the Gaza Strip. The terrorists in Gaza, Hamas, have had 18 years to build whatever power plants they wanted, instead of building terror tunnels and wasting their money and capital on developing weapons. They did nothing of the kind. They just relied on Israel. There is no provision in international law, and I'll go over that again, no provision in international law that requires one state to continue providing electricity to the state of its enemy who has just murdered 800 of its citizens. There is no requirement of that in international law. We're not discussing an idea of this is collective punishment. No, it's not. There is no reason why we should provide that electricity in the first place. We're providing it only as a result of the Oslo Accords, which have been breached from one end to the other by these terrorists. And therefore, Israel is fully entitled to cut off every flow of goods, services into the Gaza Strip. This is our enemy. Just for the British population, just imagine, let's assume that England and Argentina were neighbors and fighting over the Falkland War, over the Falkland Islands. England would never be required to continue providing Argentina with the electricity and the capability to continue attacking us. That is something which is an outrageous suggestion, and to call it collective punishment, it's a specific co-opting, really, abuse of human rights law, of human rights in general, saying this is collective punishment and it's disproportionate. Those two things, I think, go together, the disproportionality and the collective punishment. Neither of them have any factual or legal basis, but these are claims that are bandied around all the time, and with very little knowledge. They are designed to vilify Israel and to undermine our legitimacy to defend our basic human right to life. That's those claims.
If I could add one more claim to that mix, because it beggars belief, but this is something that commentators have been referencing, and that is to say that the Palestinians have a right to resist, that maybe this action has gone too far, but that it is ultimately a response, we are hearing, to the charge of occupation. I don't know if there's anything either of you want to add in relation to that particular allegation that I know our viewers have heard repeated many times over the last few days.
Yeah, obviously I think we've done specific webinars on that entire subject of, is Gaza occupied? Is it occupied territory? What are the rights of the Gazans to resist? Gaza hasn't, even if we assume, I would charge and claim erroneously that Gaza was occupied from 1967 till 2005 by Israel. Since 2005, there is no way to argue that Gaza is occupied. There is no other instance of occupation without real control of the area. Occupation assumes that, well, we're in charge of everything that happens there. Israel is responsible for, this is the example I give every time, that if an electricity pylon falls in Gaza, let's put the war aside. If we're an occupying force, then we are responsible to go into Gaza and to fix that electricity pylon. Surely you cannot be advocating the idea that after Israel left the Gaza Strip, entirely expelling its civilian population, redeploying its military forces, that we now have a positive requirement of international law to go back in by force to become the occupiers that we are not. That is a ridiculous argument. It has no basis, and it's a shame that ostensibly intelligent people bandy that around without any type of understanding of the implications of what they're claiming. The chief proponent was Michael Link from the previous special rapporteur for the Human Rights Council. How can you make that ridiculous claim without understanding the ramifications that Gaza is occupied by Israel without even boots on the ground or effective control? ignoring any type of function of international law. That's just the claim that's made. It's a basis.
Or perhaps finally, might I ask you about the IRGC? We've had quite a few questions about that, in particular from our audience in the UK. There has been, you may be aware, a long-running campaign here in the United Kingdom to have the government prescribe the IRGC. So far, there is reluctance, and that is not a decision that has been forthcoming. Undoubtedly, those efforts are going to redouble now to convince the government and the Foreign Office in particular that this is necessary. Are you able to comment on what that would potentially mean going forward? And I know we also have a lot of audience members from around Europe, whether that could feasibly be in conjunction with initiatives elsewhere to similarly prescribe the IRGC in light of the developments over the weekend.
Right. I think I think European countries have been reluctant to do this step precisely because it was perceived as inflammatory. It was perceived as a step that is, a nuclear weapon type of step that has, it begs, keeping it for really emergency situations where this is emergency. And I think that if, one doesn't need to go around in circles, in French, they say, turn the tongue around the mouth 7 times before saying something. That would be sort of, picking and choosing your words. One doesn't have to be a legal expert like yourself and Maurice in order to know that the IRGC is a terror organization. But even while having said that, a piano is a musical instrument. So the IRGC is a terrorist organization. It is simply a tautology. We have seen the IRGC's role as promoting and exporting the Islamic revolution around the Middle East. This is its job description. We have to understand this. Iran is not, we're not talking about the Iranian people. We are talking about a governmental entity under US sanctions that has been promoting terrorism for the past 40 years. Under the IRGC, and I wanted to just understand what we're talking about here. Under the IRGC, we have the Quds Force that has been sort of the long branch of the Iranian regime that has been training, funding, and espousing for terrorist groups around the Middle East. That would be a euphemism, as we say, exporting the revolution, as they say. But this is simply a euphemism for simply wreaking havoc and spreading terrorism all around the Middle East and Europe. We have seen dozens of Iranian attempts and successes to carry out terrorist attacks on European soil. These were carried out by the IRGC, by the Quds Force, by cells that were their proxies. And so this begs the question, what we can do now, having understood what Iran is capable of, having seen the heinous Iranian attack on Israeli soil, on Israeli citizens. This is not just a Hamas attack. This is an Iranian attack on Israeli citizens, murdering 900 women and children and youngsters, men and all elderly in a span of a few hours. So when it is now becoming clear what the Iranian regime's actual objective is, I don't think any country should have any more doubts. This also implies on the nuclear file that they can no longer hide behind fearing escalation. And I will also have to say, between you and me, I hope nobody's listening, that the Israeli government should also no longer hide behind this excuse of fear, concerns for escalation, wanting to prevent escalation. This has been the long-term Israeli policy. This being the long-term European policy. We have to throw all these paradigms out the window and face reality head on. The Iranian regime is a terrorist regime. We have heard the head of the Mossad saying just a few days ago. It has foiled 27 terrorist plots against Jews and Israelis around the world in a span of 1 year that were hatched and plotted by the IRGC. So I think now this is the moment of truth when we are facing Iran and deciding that we depart from past assumptions, that we are showing much more aggression about its nuclear program, that we are no longer toying with the idea of resuming the JCPOA. And yes, Europe will have to use force. It will have to support the use of force. The United States will have to use force because negotiations and talks with the Iranian regime have led us absolutely nowhere. And if we continue to feed a hungry lion what will happen is that the Iranian regime will simply take it as a green light to carry on as much as it did past the 2015 nuclear deal, 40% boost of its defense budget. We've seen the devastating results all around the Middle East, and the keeping in place the maintenance of its nuclear program in spite of the deal. If there's any message I can give you today is that really, first of all, stand with Israel, pray for Israel. We are so moved by your support, but also take it as a moment of reckoning that nothing can ever be the same in terms of defense strategy, in terms of our treatment to Iran and Hamas, in terms of how we want to avoid and avert escalation. Because when we sort of run away from war, it's blowing up on our doorstep. We need to take it as a moment to understand that our past assumptions are, I don't want to say null and void, but are definitely worth reevaluation and reckoning. And I really thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. I know we've got many prominent viewers from the UK, and in light of what you have said about Iran, I encourage everyone to redouble their efforts with respect to prescription of the IRGC. And this weekend, of course, that the whole world has seen the impact of Iran again and will no longer be able to ignore it. I think, as you both indicated, the repercussions will undoubtedly reverberate throughout the Middle East for decades to come. I'm extremely grateful to both of you for taking the time and what I know is a moment of still chaos. There is a flood of messages of support in the chat and the Q&A, and thanks to both of you for incredible insights that simply haven't been apparent on broadcast media. This has been, of course, an on-the-record discussion, and I'd encourage all of our audience members to utilize the information that you have given them in the undoubtable and doubtless the battle while it rages in Gaza is also going to continue in the arena of public opinion for some time to come. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us and for continuing to address the challenges that Israel faces in your individual ways. Israel needs you at this time. Of course, throughout its existence, it's had to fight terrorism and brutality. But I would perhaps just end with my own thoughts that in this struggle for light in darkness, I also believe it will prevail, that light will win. And finally, to every bereaved family I know, and to everyone, of course, also waiting for news of their missing ones, I know that we all embrace them and we send our prayers for their safety and for a speedy recovery to the injured. And the IDF, we wish you strength as you eradicate every terrorist enclave. And thank you to both of you for what I know you will continue to do over the coming weeks, days, and months.
Thank you so much.
More than a pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone.